Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for sharing your Friday with us here to talk about macro to microplastic in Narragansett Bay. I am Courtney Schmidt. I am the staff scientist with the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. I will be your host for the day. We're just going to jump right into it. You're going to hear all about the Estuary Program in a couple of minutes from my wonderful boss, but right now I have the immense pleasure of introducing Dr. Margaret Everett, who is the Provost here at Roger Williams University. She joined in 2020 and is serving as the Chief Academic Officer for undergraduate and graduate teaching, research, scholarship, and service. And before then, she has held many positions. She's been at Cambridge University in Boston, and she's also been at Portland State in Portland, Oregon. And she is a really cool lady with an anthropology degree from Yale University and Latin American Studies degree from Smith College. So thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Courtney. I didn't know I was going to get the full introduction there. It's very kind of you. Welcome, everyone. It's such a pleasure to welcome you and help get this great event going this morning. So I want to welcome you to today's workshop and this important topic of plastics pollution in Narragansett Bay, which RW is so pleased to be hosting. When we started our partnership with the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, this is exactly the kind of event that we had envisioned, that we could help be a convener around the region on important topics like this, and certainly plastics is a particularly important and pressing issue. And we're thrilled to be hosting it with the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which are wonderful partners. Plastics is certainly a hot button topic. It has been much in the news recently, and it focuses significant debate and action in the recent Rhode Island legislative session. It's also the subject of research among our faculty and students on our campus, and something of great shared concern. This focus on reducing pollution impacts to the Narragansett Bay aligns with Roger Williams' longstanding commitment to sustainability in our teaching, research, and institutional practices, and our more recent strategic initiatives around the blue economy, which builds on our leadership in marine science, marine and coastal law, civil and environmental engineering, and other programs on campus. Roger Williams became, as I mentioned, the host of the organization of the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program just 1 year ago, so it's also really a nice opportunity for us to celebrate that partnership and the 1 year anniversary of serving as a host. We're really delighted, as I said before, and delighted in particular to be able to host events like this that can be national and regional researchers, advocates, and concerned citizens to learn more about the challenges of plastics pollution. I want to thank Mike and Courtney and our colleagues with the Estuary Program for being such good partners. We're looking forward to more such events in the future. And I'm really looking forward to learning with all of you here today about the sources and fates of plastics in the Bay and the broader environment, their impacts on human and ecosystem health, and critically, what we as a community can do to address these complex problems. So with that, welcome. Thank you again for being here, and I hope that you have a really productive and insightful day ahead of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So I'm going to call up Mike Gerel, who's the Executive Director of the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. Yes, you did just interact it. So Mike has served as our Executive Director since 2019, and he has worked in this field for over 30 years around the country, most notably in the Chesapeake Bay Bay and in the Columbia River Estuary and the California coastal ecosystems. He's a very patient and empathetic man, and everyone who's met him in our world knows that I think his negotiation skills is probably the best thing that he's brought to the estuary program, and the fact that he can tolerate a staff full of very stubborn, independent women who like to do their own thing, and yet magically we do wonderful things together. So he is a native of Syracuse, New York, and his absolute love of his life is his dog Mocha, who's now been adopted as our staff dog, and we miss her. She needs to come back to the office. So with that, I'm going to ask Mike to tell you a bit about the script.
Thank you, Courtney. Very kind. Get you that raise.
Yes.
So, hey everyone, really, I appreciate, thank you, Margaret, thank you for Roger Williams University for having us here. It really has been a pleasure to be part of the university for the last year. What we hope would be a really great partnership has been just that and more. Being able to really lean into the parts of our work that I think us as an organization, as a staff, and as our partners that are here today really like, and this is one of them. So I'm going to talk about who we are and where we are to set the stage for the rest of the speakers today that are going to go much more specifically into the class of this topic. So we are a national estuary program. There are 28 of them, and Congress does some things right, occasionally. In 1987, they created the National Estuary Program. We were one of the first ones that joined. There are 28 of them now. You can see in this map, they're kind of big to large estuaries all around the country. We're pretty unique. We're all voluntary. We're very place-based, so we focus on not only the estuary, but the watershed that feeds them. We're overseeing our board, so to speak, is right now 33 individuals. They're a broad list of partners that are in this area, so our work is very much informed by the ground. We're very externally focused, listening organization, and that's one of the reasons we arrived at the last today. We're fortunate enough to get annual appropriations from Congress to be able to do our work. We have to fight for it every year, but it allows us to move a lot of money through our program out to our local partners. And really where we are is we try to be a stimulator, we try to be a catalyst. We end up being a nudge. We try to move things along a little bit quicker, ask difficult questions. And this program nationwide has been very successful, and it's been bipartisan support because we've been able to put out for every dollar of federal we get, another 22 arises. So it's that part of that. Put a dollar in and stimulate another 22. So it's a very unique program. So for us specifically for the estuary program, we are this region's national estuary program. We were one of the first ones, which was great, written into the Clean Water Act, so we're hosted and are a member of Roger Williams University. We are staff at Roger Williams University. We are in the Clean Water Act that we are one of the estuary programs that should exist. We don't just cover the Narragansett Bay in its watershed, we also cover Little Narragansett Bay and the coastal ponds, as you can see there. And I did read an anecdote, I have no idea if this is true. There was a border dispute between Rhode Island and Connecticut, and they were trying to decide who was going to get Narragansett Bay. And this account had said that, all right, well, we're going to take this area called, we're going to call it Little Narragansett Bay, and we're going to give some of that to Connecticut. So we are 4% of our space in Connecticut. I have no idea if it's true, but I believe it is. So I would say we are small but mighty. We have 4 staff. We bring in as many interns as we can, and we have what we call a management conference that is a series of committees that are about 50 different folks, and they're all kinds of different organizations, and we are actively working to be more diversified and as around as we can. And as Margaret said, we are hosted at the university. We are employees of Roger Williams. They handle our finances, and we work through them. And it's been, so far, been a really excellent partnership that's allowed us to focus on kind of the science geeking and community development work we do. So what is it that we do? I call this a nudge, but maybe the more formal way to say it is that we're a catalyst for scientific inquiry and collective action. We're very service-oriented. We're really not doing that much for ourselves. The services we offer, I would say, we put in 3 buckets. Consensus building, do a lot of meetings, a lot of workshops, a lot of bringing people together to try to talk about things, particularly where there's been challenges in the past. A a lot of data analysis and science communications. A lot of this, particularly this stuff, is very difficult to understand, even for someone like me that reads endlessly about scientific things. This is complicated. There was a comment when I was having a conversation earlier, if we're going to tackle these sorts of things like plastics, normal people that don't sit with a jacket, that do this for a living, need to understand what's going on with these sort of issues. We try to help with that. And the last piece, we do a lot of granting. As I mentioned, we get money that comes through our organization. You hear about the new bipartisan infrastructure law that came from the Biden administration. Out of all that, $1 million a year for 5 years is coming to us that we're able to pass through. And as for the last 2 years, and projecting next year, about 77% of our money goes out the door. So we take it and move it out and get it out to partners that can use it through contracts, subawards, other ways to try to get the money moving. We put it out for capacity building, so we hire people, we put it out for research, we put it out for planning and design. That's kind of our, we don't fund too many projects, we do the, I would say, kind of the unsexy advanced work that allows these big projects that you see during occur. We like doing that in Thorp. And so our region, where are we? I think as all of you know that grew up, lived, and spent time here, there's a really rich heritage and natural and cultural resources that are here. We are very dense. Both Rhode Island and Massachusetts follow Courtney's home state of New Jersey as being, and then Connecticut goes 2, 3, 4 in terms of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, about being very dense. There are a lot of us here in a small amount of space. This is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. I recently learned that I had some people up at Uxbridge and Mendon in the Blackstone River Valley in the 1630s. So folks have been here for a while. It helped build a nation, but Blackstone, the Altman River, the two main tributaries in the Narragansett Bay, paid a consequence for that. And so we have some catching up to do. And particularly in areas, we have a lot of cities that were old mill towns that continue to struggle, that are looking to do better. So we have some, conditions are better, there's no question. There are quotes about rivers that fed the Narragansett Bay. Don't go in the river because your skin's going to fall off, is one of the anecdotes we got from folks talking about the Blackstone River, which is where the Industrial Revolution started. We don't have that anymore. We're seeing lots of improvements. We have lots of new story maps and other things on our website where we show how we actually do better around pollution and habitat and connecting with people, that things get better. But we continue to have these challenges moving forward of urbanization. We have a lot of people. Climate change, it's real, it's here. We are right on the front lines of it. And environmental injustice. We have a lot of folks that have really been disproportionately impacted by industrial development, urbanization, and that are really on the precipice of serious problems with climate change. And I'll just say in terms of things that come up when we do polling, when we talk to people, safe access to nature is the main thing that comes up. And I include in that nature, outdoors, beaches that are free of trash. So public access, trash, plastics are the main things that we hear, no matter who you are. If you are a researcher that does deep environmental work, or you are just a citizen that is asked walking down the street, that can I go someplace that is clean and safe for my family and is free of trash, is what people uniformly say. And so just a couple things to emphasize where we are. So this just shows the density from 1940 in terms of projecting into 2030. I think as we saw during COVID, I don't know like y'all, but a lot of folks moved to Providence, moved to Rhode Island as they were moving from New York or Boston to get. So we are expecting more people to come here. It's going to get more dense. This is a tool called Storm Tools that the Coastal Resource Center in Rhode Island puts out. It puts out this is a capture that we did for this area. We are sitting right at the tip in Bristol, and it shows what the structural damage risk from flooding is under various scenarios of sea level rise. And the road we took in is going to be underwater, and likely so are we. And this just shows the area of our study area. About 75% of our towns have an area within the local census plot that would be considered an environmental justice community. So we have many communities that if because of circumstances, didn't lean into education, tourism, really are older industrial cities that have been left behind, and we have a significant part of our area that we serve that would be considered experiencing environmental injustice. And so as a consequence of that, this is just for Narragansett Bay, this just shows where our water quality is. As you can see, the top of the upper part of the bay in red is showing that it's not meeting standards. And if you look at on the other side, you can see that the habitat and other things, aquatic life, is impacted in that same area. So there are consequences to these things I mentioned around urbanization, climate change, and environmental injustice. It is occurring, it's coming up in the numbers. We're seeing it's better because of flushing and other things at the bottom, but looking at our tributaries and looking at the upper bay is having some trouble. I mean, you can do that. So I'll close with this, is that plastics have been a problem for 50 years. In 1973, there was a paper that was done, kind of one of the earlier ones that were talking about plastic materials. And just fairly recently, in 2017, I like this title for Rhode Island, was The Rising Tide of Plastic. I used to say, forget about sharks, the real menace to marine water is plastic. I think that's pretty prescient, and I think that's one of the reasons we came to this today. We really like to work on topics that are difficult, are unaddressed, are challenging, and so, I challenge you today to really sit back and listen and learn and bring your ideas forward so we can decide what role we may have, what role our partnership can have, and all of us firmly can have to look and address this problem. It's one of the most pressing for our region right now. With that, pass it back to Courtney. Thank you, Gerel.
All right, thank you. So with that, we are actually going to get jumping today. So the first person I'm going to call up is Jed Thorp, who is the Rhode Island State Director of the Clean Water Action. So Jed, many of you might know, is also was the advocacy coordinator for Save the Bay until recently. And so he has worked in the political science, environmental advocacy, policy realm for the last 20 years. And he here is going to start our question of framing the day. And as so Mike put it so eloquently before, scientists love to talk to scientists. So how do we get that out into a broader space so we can figure out how to build a community of practice?
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. When you're vertically challenged like myself, you don't like to be behind a podium, but it doesn't matter if you can see me so long as you can hear me. Good morning, everybody. As Courtney said, my name is Jed Thorp. I'm the Rhode Island State Director for Clean Water Action, and I guess I'm going to start us off today by talking a bit about some of the policies, legislation, specific issues that we and others in this space have been advocating for here in Rhode Island in recent years. Clean Water Action, we are one of just several organizations that are working in this space, and I want to give a shout out to some of the other groups that are part of our statewide plastics advocacy coalition. Save the Bay, I know Conservation Law Foundation is here today, the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, Clean Ocean Access, Zero Waste Providence, Just Zero, and there's probably several others, Surfrider, Orca, and many other local groups that are leading cleanups, neighborhood cleanups, cleanup efforts all around the state. So I want to give them a shout out today as well. Plastics advocacy takes place on a few different levels, and I'm going to talk mainly about policy and legislation, but in addition to that, there's also a lot of great work happening at what I would call the individual level. So we're trying to get individuals to improve their behavior, don't litter, do a better job with recycling, reuse items when we can, groups that are out doing neighborhood cleanups, like my friends with Friends of the Saugatucket, many other local neighborhood groups who are doing cleanups all around the state, removing thousands and thousands and thousands of water bottles, beverage containers, straws, plastic bags, what have you, from all throughout the watershed. There's also advocacy that is taking place with businesses and institutions. Clean Water Action had a program for a couple of years called Rethink Disposable, trying to get businesses and institutions to stop using single-use, easy-to-throw-away plastic items, replace them with reusable items. We had to put that program on hold for a bit during the pandemic. It became very hard just because of the increase in takeout to advocate for businesses to sort of change their practices during the pandemic. But we're going to be restarting our Rethink Disposable program here in January, which I'm excited about. And then the third item there on the list is what I'm mostly involved in, which is policy and legislation. I'm not going to talk a lot about the problem of plastic pollution, and there'll be other people later today who get into more detail about some of the specifics that we find out there in the environment, but just in terms of when we talk to legislators and decision makers about plastic pollution, this is some of what we talk about. So we talk about marine debris, we talk about giant floating islands of plastic trash in the Atlantic and the Pacific, larger than the state of Rhode Island. That really resonates when we talk to lawmakers. We talk about the specific items that we find along the coast, that we find in our communities, how many items we find. There's a group that's been doing cleanups down in South County that has this great visual, some of you may have seen it, of a canoe that is filled with nips, little plastic miniature alcoholic beverage containers filled with nips. And those visuals are very impactful when we're lobbying at the State House. We talk about impacts to wildlife. A lot of people care about marine life, turtles, shorebirds. We talk about stormwater and flooding and how problematic plastic pollution is in terms of clogging up our storm drains. We talk about litter that people can see in our communities. We talk about extending the life of the landfill. There's a lot of plastic waste that gets just buried in the landfill each and every year, and that is shortening the life of our only remaining landfill. And we talk about the need to increase and improve recycling in the state. One thing, though, that I think we've done not as great of a job of is talking about the entire life cycle of plastics. So plastics obviously are derived from petroleum and fossil fuels. Actually, the biggest projected growth industry for the petroleum, the biggest projected growth sector for the petroleum industry is not fuel, but it's plastics. So we need to talk and do a better job of talking about the entire life cycle. So extraction, transport, refining, production, and distribution, all of which have very significant impacts on climate change, for one, and just environmental justice, exposure to toxic chemicals. So there's a lot of toxics that are used in the plastic production process. And we need to do a better job of talking about not just that end of life point where we see the plastic in our environment, but the whole process from start to finish. Most of us are familiar with the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. I usually begin most conversations with legislators by pointing out that these 3 words are listed in order of importance. Right? Now, many of you know this, but there's often a lot of focus on recycling, but we don't talk enough about reduce and reuse. And when we think about policies and which policies we need to focus our attention on, we try to focus mostly on how do we reduce the plastic items that are coming into the state, getting into our environment, coming into our homes to begin with. Then how do we reuse as many items as possible? And then kind of third on that priority list is recycling. And I just want to give a shout out here to my reusable coffee mug this morning, which I realized I purchased this when I was an undergraduate student in 1998, so 24 years now. This thing has been going strong. Mostly I'm just proud that I haven't lost it yet. My wife, though, likes to ask me, well, how much BPA or toxic chemicals do you think has leached out of that coffee mug into your bloodstream? And I'm just going to choose not to think about that. In 2018, I'll kind of start recent efforts here in 2018. After several years of trying to get different plastics-related bills through the Rhode Island General Assembly with very little success, Governor Gina Raimondo created the Rhode Island Task Force to tackle plastics. And some of you here may have been a part of that task force. This was an effort to bring all these different interested parties to the table: environmental advocates, scientists, folks from the industry, retailers, legislators, get everybody in a room, get them talking to each other, thinking about solutions and trying to find some common ground. I'm not going to say that this was a worthless effort. because I think there were some good things that came out of the task force. I think anytime you can get people with diverse viewpoints and perspectives in the room together talking and interacting, I think that's usually a good thing. But ultimately, there wasn't a whole lot that was really different at the end of the day in terms of the plastic problem as a result of the task force. One very concrete thing that did come out of the task force, one very specific policy recommendation, and the final report, this is the photo of the final report, talked about, maybe doing something about straws, addressing polystyrene food containers, but there was a very specific model legislation at the end of the report for a statewide ban on single-use plastic bags. And at that time, we already had, I think, 14 or 15 of the 39 communities in Rhode Island that had already passed local bans on single-use plastic bags. So Barrington was the first, I think in maybe 2012, and then several other communities, thanks to the hard work of folks at Clean Ocean Access and others, adopted similar statewide bans on single-use plastic bags. We thought that was kind of some low-hanging fruit, right? Like, we already had a lot of communities that had done this. This recommendation was coming out of this task force that had everybody at the table. But that bill did not pass in 2019. So this is the 5671, sponsored by my friend Gerel McEntee, was introduced in 2019. The bill did not pass that year. There were some changes that were made to the legislative language. I won't get into all the details about that, but some people weren't happy with some of the tweaks that were made, so we didn't get it passed in 2019. In 2020, we thought we had a good chance when we came back that year. Then, all hell broke loose in March of 2020. The legislature really didn't do much on the environment or any issue really during most of 2020, so we didn't get it passed in 2020. I thought for sure we were going to get it done in 2021. It was still kind of a weird year with the pandemic. We didn't get it passed in 2021, but finally, last year, after 4 years, we finally got the statewide ban on single-use plastic bags passed. The takeaway here is that anything that you try to do in terms of legislation, even the seemingly easy stuff, is going to be met with opposition, and it's going to be really hard to get it passed. So even this bill that we thought was going to be kind of slam dunk, the lowest hanging fruit, took us 4 years to get passed. That's in part because anything that you try to ban has some constituency, industry front group, lobbying group that's going to advocate on the other side of the table for you. So this is a graphic here. This is not a map of the Electoral College vote, although the colors are kind of similar. This is a map. The states in blue are maps are states that have passed either statewide or local bans on single-use plastic bags. And the states there in orange are states where the industry has been successful in getting preemption laws passed, or what I like to call bag ban bans passed to prohibit cities and towns from passing their own restrictions on single-use plastic bags. The photos here show some of the other items that we have attempted to address via legislation here in Rhode Island. In 2021, so last year, we got passed the straw bill, or what we call the Ask First straw bill. So if you go to a restaurant now in Rhode Island, by law, they are not supposed to just give you a straw by default. You are supposed to ask for the straw before they give it to you. We got that bill passed last year. We can debate how impactful or successful that law has been. We also, last year, thanks to the work of my friend Susan Donovan from Bristol, we got a statewide ban passed on the release of balloons. A lot of balloons are actually not plastic or latex or rubber. The Mylar balloons are particularly problematic when they get into the environment. We also had, this got a lot of press, last year there was a proposed bill to ban these nip bottles, which are particularly problematic. They can't really effectively be recycled here at Rhode Island's MRF because they're too small. They fall down through the grates at the recycling facility. And you walk along any part of the shoreline, through the park in the state, you're going to find sometimes piles of these little miniature alcoholic containers. That bill will probably get introduced again next year, And then we've also had bills to ban polystyrene food containers, which I think this is probably the lowest hanging fruit now at this point, because many cities and towns have passed bans on polystyrene food containers, and I think we have a good chance of getting that one done. But again, for each of these items, there's somebody who manufactures these who doesn't want to see these banned, right? So we run up against a lot of opposition. The big priorities really for us and the other groups that are part of our Plastics Coalition are the next two things that I'm going to talk about. The first being container deposit law, also known as a bottle bill. There have been a lot of efforts in Rhode Island over many decades to try to get a bottle bill passed here in Rhode Island. This map shows other states that already have bottle bills on the books. You'll see that our neighbors in Connecticut and Massachusetts have had a bottle bill on the books for many decades now. The good thing about a bottle bill is that we don't have to guess as to how a bottle bill is going to work, right? We have decades of experience from our neighbors as to how this is going to work. We know from the data that on average, recycling rates are 2 to 2.5 times higher in states that have a bottle bill on the books. Despite claims from the Beverage Association and the industry, the bottle bill did not ruin the economy in Massachusetts or Connecticut. We know that we can do this, and we know that we can learn from our examples from our neighbors and our surrounding states. So we'll be pushing for that again next year, and we know that the Beverage Association will lobby hard and spend a lot of money to try to kill that. And then the other priority for us is what's known as extended producer responsibility, or EPR, for packaging. Plastic packaging waste is one of the most problematic forms of plastic right now because so many of the items that we buy are now packaged in plastic. Tens of thousands of tons of packaging material, plastic packaging material, is buried in the landfill each and every year. Much of it is very difficult, if not impossible, to reuse or recycle. And several states now have already passed EPR for packaging. So Maine was the first state, I believe, last year. California has passed an EPR bill this year, Colorado and others, and many other states are looking at EPR legislation as well. The concept of EPR is not really a new concept. We already have producer responsibility programs for hard-to-dispose-of items like mattresses, for example. We have a mattress program, hazardous paint, mercury thermostats. The basic concept here is that the producers of these hard-to-dispose-of items should be held responsible for the eventual disposal or management of these hard-to-dispose-of waste. I'll also talk about one thing that we have to play defense on, and it's this notion what the industry calls advanced recycling. Okay? This is an industry branding term. Basically, this is where you take hard-to-dispose-of plastics. They say it's not incineration, technically, because we're not burning it. It's in absence of oxygen, but they heat up plastic, melt it down into like a char material, which then gets used in certain applications. The industry likes to tout this, the Chemistry Council touts this as a great solution to the plastics problem. They like it because it does nothing to slow the flow of plastics coming into the system, right? This is an end-of-use solution. There's a lot of concerns with this. It's very energy intensive. There's toxic emissions concerns. It's an environmental justice concern. These facilities, so-called advanced recycling facilities, often cited in environmental justice communities. And if you're on Facebook and you live in Rhode Island, you may have seen these ads. The Chemistry Council spent a lot of money to try to push this bill through the legislature. We were successful in killing it this year. It passed in the Senate, but we were able to kill it in the House. And then lastly, I'll just talk about here's some of the things that I think are needed for us to be more effective and successful with our lobbying efforts going forward. Obviously, there needs to be more and better education of decision makers. We need to help them better understand the problem, better understand the solutions. Some of these policy solutions, bottle bill, even more so EPR, the bills are somewhat long. The mechanics of how all of it works is kind of clunky. So we need to do a better job of explaining this to decision makers. We need to do a better job of engaging and educating the public. So ultimately, I always say there's two sources of power in politics, money and people. And if we're going to be successful in passing some of these policies, we have to get people engaged. We have to create public demand for some of these solutions. And we have to bring new voices to the table. So we need to bring the scientific community to the table. Folks who are managing wastewater systems and dealing with the problem of plastic pollution. We have to bring them to the table, bring that voice to the table, and diversify the voices so that it's not just environmental organizations who are calling for some of these solutions. Now that's sometimes hard to do because with the legislative process, we often have very short notice when bills are going to be heard. So sometimes we only have 2, 3, or 4 days notice that a bill is going to be heard, and it's hard to get scientists and people who aren't in the weeds on this stuff every day to make the time to be able to turn out for legislative hearings. And with that, I guess I'll stop there. And this is one of my favorite pictures from Life magazine, I think 1955, celebrating the wonders of plastic. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jed. So he will be around later if you have any questions about those. And as you can see, it seems like Rhode Island is moving. There's lots of discussion going on this, and there's definitely space for more folks to sit at this table. And so to kind of bring us a step back, I'm going to introduce Dr. Rebecca Altman. She is an author, and she is writing the book on plastic pollution in the country. And so this isn't a new issue. And so Rebecca is going to share with us her research, and she is a writer, an environmental sociologist whose work explores the social history of plastic and people and how we are intimately tied together. Her work has appeared everywhere. She did a really excellent TEDx talk in San Francisco, which is kind of what laid the foundation. And she has a very recent Atlantic article, which is how I found out about her name and the fact that she lives in Providence, Rhode Island. So of course I was going to drag her to this, whether or not she wanted to be here, and I'm so glad she wants to be here. So she holds a PhD from Brown University and serves on the board of directors of the Science and Environmental Health Network, which is a national think tank. And she's currently putting all of this work into a book that we can all buy and love and read as much as we can. So with that, thank you, Rebecca.
How are we doing? Okay. Good morning. All right, we're going to start this off with a story. And this is a very visual talk, so hopefully this is a good 9 a.m. block for you. All right, so I'm not originally from the Narragansett Bay Estuary. I'm from New Jersey, but my dad grew up here, and this is a picture of him. He studied chemical engineering at the University of Rhode Island. And though he was not trained in polymer science or in plastics production, when he graduated in 1962, nonetheless, Union Carbide, one of the largest producers of plastics in the 20th century, hired him to make plastics, so he had to learn that on the job. 40 years later, I moved back to Rhode Island to study the legacy and history of plastics. All right. Okay, so here's what happened in the intervening years. Dad made plastics for about 10 years. He made polystyrene. Here's where my props come in. He made butadiene rubber-modified polystyrene squishy. If you've ever played beer pong and had a red solo cup, that is butadiene-modified polystyrene. Not, as he likes to show, crushy polystyrene that crinkles and cracks, and definitely not foamed polystyrene, which he hated with a white-hot passion for reasons I do not understand. So Dad made butadiene. That's the kind of plastic he made. Right after he left, a bunch of drums, 4,500 drums, were found in central New Jersey. It had come off the polystyrene unit where he had worked. At a Superfund site, it was proverbially cleaned up, but 20 years later, there was still quite a bit of toxics in the water between that site and another. These were the headlines I grew up with. Dad would clip them and put them next to my breakfast table. This is what I would read growing up. Kids were sick, and not long after this, so was Dad. He was diagnosed with cancer the year before I started grad school. So here's what I learned growing up. that plastic is more than plastic, that there's a lot of plastic-associated pollutants and additives that are part of this system, it had me much more focused on plastics production than merely on its consumption. And it taught me pretty early that plastic plants produce a lot more than plastics. So let's talk about production. So this is a pretty popular graph from a 2017 study that shows that something like 8.3 billion metric tons of plastics have been produced since 1950, or between 1950 and 2015. So what we can also see here is the era in which I've been studying plastics. Plastics have been made at a far greater scale than the era in which Dad made plastics. That's the little gray box. This is the study that this comes from. And one of the things that this really highlights, what I want to highlight for you is that, that 1950 is not the year mass plastics began. 1950 is the year we have good global aggregate data for understanding plastics production that they could plug into their model, and then we could get to this understanding. That there's a much longer history of plastics, and it's important to understand that so that we can understand what has driven us towards mass plastics, and we can better understand the levers for collaboration and change. Surely there is something going on since 1950, and it's part of a larger trend. Environmental historians call this period the Great Acceleration. You can see this kind of hockey puck graph for a number of other indicators, not just plastics production, but paper production, primary energy use. So in the graph, it could look like plastics were like a negligible at the 1950 mark. But actually, that data point for that year is 4.4 billion pounds of plastic. And that amount of plastic is not just made overnight. It comes from somewhere. It took an infrastructure getting laid and technology to be developed in order to get to that level of production. This is my older slides. Yeah. But we'll go through it. I'm going to do this backwards. I had originally set this up backwards, but just come with me. Here we go. We're going to zoom all the way back to 1850. 1850, this is natural latex rubber. Okay, and rubber could be molded into all kinds of goods, but it was not temperature stable once that good was moved outside of the tropical regions where this kind of latex is harvested until the invention of vulcanization, which is going to semi-modify that polymer through heat and through sulfur chemistry to create rubber goods. 1851, the Crystal Palace Great Exhibit, presided over by Queen Victoria. This was Prince Albert's pet project. Brought all the great industrial ideas of that era to England to be on display. Charles Goodyear filled 3 rooms with proof of concept that vulcanized rubber was the future. Everything from boats to life jackets to buckets to bottles. It also became a very important material good during the Civil War, vulcanized rubber. There's a fabulous book at the Smithsonian that yay thick about the kinds of goods that were already available in 1850. So, bio-based, right? Must be a relatively benign material. The environmental history literature on the significance of human rights violations that occurred in order to extract that volume of rubber is profound. There is literature from Peruvian Amazon, from Africa, from Southeast Asia, and time and again, whether the rubber was wild harvested or cultivated on plantations, involved forced labor, genocide, and human rights violations. The literature on this is clear, and this was a major public issue of that era. It was in the papers of that era. It was no better inside hard rubber factories. If you have ever used the phrase "to be gassed," that is a legacy of hard rubber production. Some of the toxic feed materials coming in, even in the 19th century, naphtha, carbon bisulfide, or disulfide as it's called now, had huge neurological effects for workers working very long hours under conditions with poor ventilation. But rubber factories were developed all over the world. Here's two that were in Naugatuck, Connecticut, which was a hard rubber hub. We have also extensive medical literature from the mid-1800s on, particularly in France, documenting case after case after case of carbon disulfide poisoning. There's also a long history of extractive mining for sulfur to feed into the chemical industries to make the carbon disulfide to then vulcanize the rubber. You get the point. Plastic is bigger than just the actual polymer itself. It takes this whole network of people and places and chemicals to make it work. This is the India Gutta Percha company in Silvertown, London, East London. It was one of the big high-tech industries of the time. And here, the history of this particular facility, again, repeats what was going on inside that facility for the workers, but also for the tenement communities that surrounded this facility, dealing with runoff, soot, pollution. Also an incredible history of labor organizing here, particularly for the unionization of women. That a very important moment in labor history happened at this hard rubber gutta percha factory. 3,000 people walked off the job at one point. So they were doing hard rubber, but they were also doing gutta percha. Gutta percha was used to line the telegraph cables as telegraphy was coming online and starting to knit together the world through undersea cables and enabling faster communication. It was also the means by which empire was administered. If there was a rebellion somewhere in the British holdings, this was how Britain was able to communicate and to administer that empire. As a result, nations were spending a significant amount of money developing gutta percha. Gutta percha was harvested from Southeast Asia. Unlike rubber, you don't tap that tree, it was felled. About a 60-foot tree would make about a pound of rubber. It's not a lot. So when the first transatlantic cable was laid in the 1850s, it required 250 tons of gutta percha to insulate those cables. That cable had to be laid multiple times before it worked, and then you can imagine how many other cables were laid as the entire globe was threaded together. This led to massive deforestation throughout Southeast Asia, to the point where the British government was trying to think about their early forest policy by the end of the century. One historian, John Tully, called it a Victorian-era ecological disaster. Some of the first entanglements happened at this time. Other entanglements were also recorded of fish with rubber bands. And there was a headline at the time, how are all these rubber bands getting into the sea? So our issue today has got some pretty interesting historical precedents. Another early development at this time was cellulosics. We call it celluloid today. Parkesine was a particularly early idea of using cellulose, the most widespread polymer in nature, to create a plastic material. Parkesine was developed in London and showcased at the 1862 Expo there, but Parkes was not a good businessman, and that business folded within 2 years. But the American brothers, the Hyatt brothers, actually did get it going. So celluloid takes off in the latter part of the 19th century. New Jersey becomes a hub for celluloid production. Here is their headquarters in Newark. But there were factories in Russia, in Japan, all across Europe. Here's one in Germany that was built in 1880, and you'll see it was rebuilt 5 years later because these were incredibly explosive and dangerous facilities to work in. There's some phenomenal old insurance. You can go through old insurance archives and see how the insurance companies were really loath to insure celluloid manufacturers. Yet, one of the stories you most often hear in the media is that early plastics were this environmental good because they spared elephants their ivory or tortoiseshell. In fact, Xylenite in London, which continued the Parkes adventure in celluloid, used their charismatic megafauna as their logo, a little turtle and a little elephant. And celluloid company, even if it was advertising not its famous billiard ball, which actually wasn't that good, but teeth, will say things like, celluloid has come to the relief of the whale. We don't have to or to the elephant and the tortoise in their native haunts. And that didn't actually really pan out. And here's why. Though there was some substitution, celluloid did, for example, replace homes right here in Leominster. Is that in the watershed, Leominster? Leominster began as Cone City, where they were making artisan homes from horn, but they were an early adopter of celluloid plastics. This here is the Viscaloid company. DuPont would go on to buy this. They would start producing celluloid homes. And then this became kind of an incubator space for the development of next generation plastics like a cellulose acetate, and where in the United States, manufacturers imported injection molding technology to really take plastics to the next level. So this becomes a really important city. We can talk about that in a second. I love these two pictures. These are from the DuPont archives. This is a father and son, 20 years apart. The father was able to make 350 combs a day, but after injection molding got going, son could do 10,000 a day. And then the Leominster fought to have its name changed from Comb City to Plastic Pioneer City. But the thing about celluloid is its primary use was not in objects, it was in film. And so it wasn't actually sparing any elephant at all. There's two movies. This is the second, 1938. There was an earlier one in 1937, which shows, with a lot of horrific racist imagery, the connections between celluloid production and the Jim Crow South production of cotton, because cellulose was made from cotton linters, cotton waste. And here's the other important thing, that stories about early plastics' environmental benefits often conceal, which is that in order to make celluloid plastics, it requires camphor as a solvent system, as a plasticizer, and camphor was primarily sourced from Taiwan. If you look on the map there, you'll see like a peachy beige in the middle. Those are the camphor forests. Again, extensive environmental historical literature about the multiple empires that vied for control over the camphor forests, Japan, China, England, and the violent displacement of indigenous communities off their historical and ancestral lands in order to access and industrialize camphor, so we could have film here and elsewhere. There was not a whole lot of learning from history, despite multiple generations of excellent data on what carbon disulfide was doing for hard rubber workers. It was became instrumental to the viscose rayon process. Viscose chemistry either goes towards rayon fiber or towards cellophane film. And again, carbon disulfide was the instrumental material in enabling that technology. And so rayon used it, rayon production went bananas, and so did exposures for another generation of workers. Here is a telegram that Alice Hamilton received about an incident of what was called carbon bisulfide at the time, poisoning among rayon workers in Delaware. There's an excellent book on this out from Yale Press. Paul Blank, he's a physician. I think he teaches at UCSF. He wrote this book, Fake Silk, all about carbon disulfide. It is a phenomenal book. But one of the points he makes is that even this issue continues today. Carbon disulfide is still used in the rayon industry, even for rayon that is advertised as FSC certified, as if the quote comes from like a well-managed again, Vapor-like plastic came, it's kind of like this watershed moment in which plastics start to make this conversion from primarily biomass into synthetics. It was a coal tar-based, half coal tar-based chemical. It was a reaction of phenol and formaldehyde. Initially, formaldehyde came from wood chemistry, and phenol came through coal tar chemistry. And it was a really important moment, but the thing is it needs a filler. And they did use wood flour for a very long time, imported from Norway, where they have a relationship with a mill up in Maine. But another of the major fillers is asbestos. So my point is, long before World War II, here's where we are. The United States started production data in 1939. Principally, the materials were phenolics and cellulosics. And if you can see, it's very hard to see. This is a map from Modern Plastics, 1940. It's concentrated in Massachusetts and New Jersey. A fair amount of that in our watershed. Plastics is starting to make this march in the pre-war eras from principally bio-based into a coal tar, and then you see the beginnings of plastics association with petroleum chemistry in the interwar years. Dow was doing this, Standard Oil was doing this. Most of my historical work has been focused on Union Carbide. Union Carbide bought a gas plant up the Elk River in Clendenin, West Virginia in 1920, and began working with the ethane that the gas manufacturer had allowed to weather off. And they started developing ethylene derivatives, and what was then beginning to be called petrochemicals, which is this portmanteau, like this suitcase here. It folds two meanings into one. So electronic, mail, email, smoke, fog, smog, petroleum industry, chemical industry, distinct, folded together into petrochemistry for the first time. They had figured it out enough to buy a bigger factory just down the river, the Canal River in Charleston. And there they started developing Prestone antifreeze, and then they started developing products from their byproducts. Every process they ran had a byproduct. And then they developed that, and that's how they eventually get to vinyl. Vinyl was a terrible failure at first. They couldn't formulate it, and then once they co-polymerized it with another kind of vinyl, they got it, but then they couldn't sell it. And so they had to learn to be as inventive with their marketing, the invention of markets, as they were with their invention of molecules. This is a story I tell for Orion magazine if you want more details. But one of their first sales was to line beer cans. Vinyl. What you see after this is either vertical integration of some of the companies or co-location. This is the Route Carbide plant. Their next facility they built next to Standard Oil on the shores of Lake Michigan in Whiting, Indiana. And so this is a pattern you see. Oops. Let me go back there. So what I want you to understand is that even before 1950, even before World War II became this huge engine, mass production was going on. And by the time World War II is ready to start, we have mass facilities producing vinyl in West Virginia, in Germany producing early polystyrene, and in England producing polyethylene. I want to talk just quickly about the war. Yeah? You guys doing all right? Yeah? Okay. Because I can, All right. So the war, we talk about the war as being an engine for plastics. Let's talk a little bit about how. The Manhattan Project was one of the most significant funders of early Teflon, which is a fluorinated polymer. DuPont had it, but they couldn't make it at scale. And the Manhattan Project put in the money and the pressure to get going on Teflon, also some of the PFAS chemicals. If you want more on that, I read that history for AO Magazine. Let's talk about polystyrene. It has war origins. On par with the scale and financing of the Manhattan Project was the U.S. Synthetic Rubber Project. They built out a huge infrastructure to make synthetic rubber. What does synthetic rubber need? Styrene and butadiene. Could those be made at scale in the United States at that time? Not really. So the governments were building these factories and the companies buy them back. So they're getting a leg up. They're able to lay down that infrastructure and get early contracts to begin making this stuff. Here's an ad from Mobil Gas for actually making the rubber. I don't know if you can see it up there. So Uncle Sam owns it. 5 oil companies run it for free. Here are some of the Union Carbide got to build styrene and butadiene facilities, some of the first in this country. And so here's what we get from that. Dow was another major manufacturer of styrene at the time. Here's an ad from that era. And up at the top, they talk about anticipating styrene's honorable discharge and its service for a peacetime economy. Now, a significant amount of styrene went towards rubber thereafter, but the rest was filled by polystyrene. And here's when polystyrene takes off. Here's a Dow model holding aloft. The graph is kind of hard to see, but I'll have you look at the y-axis because that helps you see just the scale of polystyrene production going up in the US after the war. Here's another thing. The US and the UK deputized chemists and plastic makers and sent them to Germany before the war was even over to tour facilities because the Germans knew how to make polystyrene and others. And so they came back with samples, they came back with drawings, they came back with all kinds of information as they pressed the German chemists. Talk about tech transfer. Here's another example of tech transfer. Polyethylene came to the United States because the Navy negotiated with ICI in the UK so that DuPont and Bakelite, at that point bought by Carbide, could start making it in the United States. Talk about a counterfactual moment in history. How would this market have worked if ICI completely held a patent for making polyethylene and 2 US companies did not get early goings on it? Here's another one. 1947, the plastics industry starts offering, or New Orleans and Louisiana starts offering tax incentive for the plastics industry to locate in Louisiana. 1948, they're offering some pretty excellent tax policies to bring the industry to that 100-mile stretch between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Here's what that looks like today. You've seen it in the news quite a bit lately. St. James Parish has been in the news for ousting Formosa plastics. Okay, this is from the Atlantic. Yellow dots are plantations where cotton, sugar, indigo were made with enslaved labor, and petrochemical plastics plants buy up those properties and build huge facilities on them, wedging in between them those communities of formerly enslaved families that are the descendants of the formerly enslaved in between them. This is the route for environmental justice in that region. 1947, again, Congress passes the Tongass Timber Act up in southeast Alaska. It's enclosed off the lands of the ancestral lands of the Haida and Tlingit people. They want to develop this. They want to put pulp and paper mills in. They're offering 50-year contracts under market rate. Pulp. Newspaper companies don't take them up on it. Paper doesn't take them up on it. Who takes them up on it? Rayon. The Tongass went to rayon production. A U.S. company went in on the mill that went in Ketchikan, and Japanese rayon interest went in on the unit in Sitka. Okay, Rhode Island connection real fast, and we'll wrap this up. So now we have polyethylene in the United States. We don't really know what to do with it because it's primarily used for radar cable. It replaced kind of what Gutta Percha was doing in the undersea cables. So this gentleman here, his name is Earl Tupper, manufacturer of the land of Bryant University, maker of Tupperware. He worked at that Leominster DuPont biscuit factory, where DuPont was working with that injection molding, and he actually apprenticed with some of the best injection molders around at that time, and he got a lot of ideas doing that, and he left DuPont, and he designed his burpable bowl with the seal, and off he went. He also got an early sneak peek at polyethylene because DuPont had it and was making it. I don't know if you can see because of the light, but in the background, all of those bags in the back of them says polyethylene made by Bakelite, owned by Union Carbide, and they're playing with the pellets. That is Brownie Wise. She's the inventor, essentially, of the Tupperware party that was the engine driving Earl Tupper's Tupperware into the American home. Okay, so those bags are 50-pound bags. Within 10 years, this is how Tupperware is receiving its polyethylene by the tank car. This tank car is actually rolling up to this factory on the Blackstone River. This is a cotton mill. My great-grandfather, a Polish immigrant, worked there. Then it was a Tupperware mill. How cool is that? Plastics are everywhere. And if you watch this film, you can do this afterwards, It's a Wonderful World of Tupperware, you can see this factory in operation. It is now condos with a Tupperware Avenue address. All right, a couple more things. Ready? Jed showed this picture, Life magazine. I actually want to tell you there's not a lot of plastics in this picture. It's mostly aluminum and paper. I'm sorry. The reason why is that aluminum and paper led the country towards disposability. Plastics kind of followed in the trajectory of aluminum and paper. Here's a speech, 1955, the editor of Microplastics, basically telling his colleagues, hey, the future of plastics is going to be in the trash can. And believe it or not, he got a lot of pushback from that. But by 1963, he said, we've done it, the happy day has arrived. Plastics are not too good to throw away. But I ask you to think about disposability as a social innovation, an invention as significant as polyethylene, as injection molding. I mean, it had to be taught, particularly to a society coming out of war deprivations, coming out of the Depression. The one on the far left, that's steel, that's Bethlehem steel, and they're saying, do you tote or take your empties, or toss them? There's the basis why bottle bills are having a hard time. But plastics followed suit, saying you don't need to refill a salt shaker, you can just use it and toss it. And here we have a polystyrene cup. Already on and throw away. So I had one other slide that I built for you that filled in this period between 1970 and 2000, and it was all the ridiculous headlines that were going on in that era. Because plastics was under assault, and the headlines were coming from within the industry. Our embattled industry, we're on the rails. Because 1970, we have Earth Day. 1974, you have microplastic beads on the cover of Science magazine. You have headlines in the New York Times about marine pollution. The White House has a task force. I mean, the issue of plastics was all over the place in 1970s, from vinyl chloride exposures in workers to solid waste issues, the beginnings of recycling happened here. This is the era in which plastics was a dominant industry in the area of public relations and lobbying. They beat back the first bottle bills, they beat back the first plastic bag bans, they beat back the first polystyrene bans, and were successful in getting the public to pay for recycling. And so it's really important to realize that we have deep, deep roots here. The problem with plastics goes back to the beginning, and people have been rallying against better environments and better relationships to this material from the beginning. From the beginning. All right, closing slide. This is my friend James. He's a photojournalist in Kenya. Someone's taking a picture of James taking a picture of a bunch of plastics in a river. I love this picture because I believe James is looking upward at the downstream effects. If you look at the history of plastics, we now have the global waste trade returning plastic waste to the places where its earliest incarnations were extracted. Southeast Asia, Africa, South America. And the downstream implications are huge. But if anything, I believe that the plastics history teaches us that plastics plants produce more than plastics, that plastics are held up by a network of toxics, and that these upstream issues are as important to address as we tackle these downstream issues as well. How about that?
That's okay. I will. Okay. So again, Rebecca's agreed to hang out with us. In the interest of kind of rolling through, I just wanted to keep us going. If anyone needs to pop up, I mean, if you're following the schedule, we should be heading towards a coffee break. So if you need to pop up and stretch your legs, the coffee is actually like right behind us. So, just do your best to not interrupt, but don't, feel free. We've built in a lot of time to chat in the coffee breaks and Q&A discussions. So I'm actually gonna kind of open things up, and we have a schedule change at the end of the day. So if you can hang out after lunch, we have even more time to chat. All right, so with that, I am going to switch gears. I think Rebecca here set up a completely great segue to Dr. Scott Coffin. And so we've had this amazing where we are now in terms of what we're facing as a state and a region. We have where we've been, and now we have the ability to make some drastic changes. And so that is what Dr. Scott Coffin is going to talk about. He has a PhD in environmental toxicology and serves as a research scientist at the California State Water Resources Control Board. So since 2014, he has been focusing on microplastic toxicity and characterization. He's leading the development of drinking water regulations in California and advising management strategies across ecosystems on how to tackle this issue. So I'm going to allow Scott to take it away and maybe give us a hint of what the future of New England can look like if we can model ourselves after the good things California is up to. Thank you.
Wow, what a pleasure to follow Dr. Rebecca Altman. It's been a goal of mine for a long time to be in the same room with Dr. Rebecca. So, yeah, really set it up really nicely to bring us to where we are today. And I'm going to try and give you an overview of where we're at in terms of bringing this historical understanding of plastic pollution into the modern age of regulations and policy, and think forward about how we can do better. So, I'm not going to cover the problem in too much detail because we're all aware of it, we're all here, but these images are now very commonplace. The average person is well aware of the plastic pollution issue by this point. And plastic, it goes everywhere, as we all know in this room. As consumers use it, it can make its way into our waste stream as well as into our drinking water supplies through aerial deposition, rain, sea spray, littering. There are many routes to get into our ecosystem and as well as our bodies. Excuse me. And as we know, the issue with plastic is that it doesn't just go away, it degrades into smaller and smaller particles. So this is a picture of something that is now largely banned in the United States, thanks to a law passed in 2015 signed by Barack Obama. Plastic microbeads used to be commonplace in many cosmetics, and if you look at one of these microbeads under a scanning electron microscope, you can actually visualize how this particle is breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. So this is at the 100 micron scale. You can zoom in on the 10 micron scale, look at that small particle, and you can look even further. Now we're looking 100 times smaller than the largest picture, and you can actually see the formation of nanoplastics from this one particle. So it's very easily to visualize with this how one particle becomes many particles. And harkening back to the little bit of a history lesson, these through lines, the first understanding that we have of plastic pollution, the actual particles interacting with mammalian biology, is from a study published in 1960 that documented the translocation of polystyrene beads latex particles into rodents. And the authors from this study concluded that this is probably problematic for the health of humans, and we should do more studies. There were not more studies for about 40 more years, though. Thinking about the first environmental plastic science published, this actually came from Woods Hole University in 1972. Edward Carpenter and his colleague Dr. Schmidt, they documented increasing microplastic concentrations in the Sargasso Sea. They were not looking for plastic, they were looking for sargassum, and they stumbled upon all of these particles that were contaminating. And if you follow Dr. Rebecca Altman on Twitter, you'll see that there's a lot more to this story. Dr. Carpenter was visited by a plastics manufacturer, trade association, not long after he published this article, and was effectively scared out of continuing this research. And so zooming forward now today, 2018, we have, sorry, it's 2022 now, but 2018 recent history, we have the first real legislative attempt to address plastic and microplastic pollution holistically. The California State Legislature passed Senate Bill 1263, which provides a lot of mandates to the regulatory authorities in California, including coming up with a statewide microplastic strategy by 2022, and then by 2026, developing a risk assessment framework to get microplastics into the existing Clean Water Act regulatory framework, developing standardized analytical methods to monitor, establishing baseline occurrence data, figuring out how microplastics make it into our oceans and bays, and then recommending source reduction strategies back to the legislature. Just before this bill was passed, first study to ever look for microplastics in tap water found it in 94% of samples of the United States and 83% of samples worldwide. This was fairly buzzworthy, and although it was the first and at this time the only study to ever look for microplastics in tap water, it took just a few months for that paper to turn into law, and California passed Senate Bill 1422, which is tied to 1263. It has a lot of similar mandates, but it's narrowly focused on drinking water, and first it required that we define microplastics in a legal sense, which to that date had not ever been done before. It also requires us to adopt a standardized method, adopt a plan for 4 years of testing and monitoring of microplastics in California's drinking water, consider adopting a health-based guidance level so that when we tell consumers you have 25 particles per liter of microplastics in your drinking water or whatever, they're not wondering what that means for their health, and accredit laboratories so that we can feel confident about the results. So I'll talk a little bit about the definition. Defining microplastics is not a trivial task. This is something that scientists have struggled to do forever. We're not entirely sure what we mean by plastic. We're not entirely sure what we mean by micro. Is it below 1 micron? Is it microscopic? And really this class of contaminants that consider microplastics includes over 10,000 unique polymers with a distribution of sizes, shapes, and colors. So we adopted a definition that was largely based on some growing consensus to inform regulations in Europe. And we believe that this definition is wide enough that it includes the particles that we have evidence for toxicity now, and a lot of the particles that we don't even know exist yet. This includes solid polymeric materials to which chemical additives or other substances may have been added, which are particles which have at least 3 dimensions that are greater than 1 nanometer and less than 5,000 micrograms. So notice that this spans 3 orders of magnitude in size. 6 orders of magnitude. Polymers that are derived in nature that have not been chemically modified other than by hydrolysis are excluded. So that's to say if it's a natural polymer, it doesn't fit in the definition, but if you modify it even slightly chemically, and now it's considered plastic. So now that we have an understanding or a common language for what we even consider to be the contaminant that we are examining, we can do some additional research. The human and ecological health effects of microplastics are not well understood, and to fulfill these legislative mandates, we organized a series of health effects workshops with experts from the field as well as local regulators in California. And we charged our health effects workshop group with answering some questions about what are the dose metrics that are important to understand the health effects of microplastics. Is it the particle count? Is it the mass of the particle, the volume of the surface area? What particle characteristics drive toxicity? Is size more important than shape? Does the polymer matter? What are the actual adverse effects to humans and to different organisms? And can we use the existing data to derive regulatory thresholds? So the first thing that we did was identify what hazards are associated with plastics. We found that there's evidence for 2 primary hazards, which are mediated by the chemicals associated with the plastics and the particles themselves. As far as chemicals go, there are many of them. at least 10,000 known additives commonly used in plastics, of which 2,400 are substances of concern, meaning that they're either toxic, bioaccumulative, persistent, or a combination. 53% of those are unregulated in the United States, and 11% we know virtually nothing about. What we do know is that plastic as a vector for chemicals does not seem to be environmentally relevant under most conditions. The 1972 Carpenter and Schmidt article documented PCBs and DDTs that had been adsorbed to these polystyrene particles and hypothesized that a fish ingesting those particles could get a high dose of PCBs. And many studies since then, laboratory as well as field monitoring and modeling studies have found that it's likely that the plastic as a vector or as a Trojan horse for these chemicals is highly unlikely to be a relevant transfer mechanism. So just to give you an idea, the percentage of the hydrophobic organic contaminants, so all of these hydrophobic organic contaminants that are bound to environmental media in the ocean, this is on a log scale. So the vast majority is in the water column, and you can see plastic is 0.0001% relative to 100 for water. And there's been a lot of modeling studies that show that in many cases the plastic is actually cleaning the organism of these persistent organic pollutants that the organism is getting from many other sources, including the food web, the water, the dissolved organic carbon in the water. That's not to say that those added chemicals are not an issue. The jury is still out on that. We believe that the BPA and all the analogs, all these chemicals that are intentionally added to plastics, those could still be relevant. Plastic could still be a relevant transfer mechanism because they're originating from the plastic particles themselves, and they're not already just out there in the water column. So moving on to particle hazards, this is really what our health effects workshop focused on. We first needed to understand what are the adverse mechanisms, what effects are actually occurring. And we depended on a recent meta-analysis that weighted the evidence, the quality of different toxicity studies, and found studies that had either suggested or demonstrated different adverse effects. And they rated these by the score of these studies. They found that we have high-weighted evidence for plastic particles causing inhibited food assimilation and or decreased nutritional value. Suffice to say, this is called food dilution. Basically, the particles take up space in the organism's gut. They can't get nutrient from their food. We have additional information for other types of physical damage that can occur inside the organism. You can think of a sharp particle interacting with tissue, causing lacerations. And then we also have some information for oxidative stress, very small particles causing harm at the molecular level. So now that we have an understanding for how these particles cause harm, it informs what to do with existing data. If you look at dose-response curves for plastics from different sizes, and you're looking at the particle count, which is often the metric that is reported by researchers, you get completely different dose-response curves depending on how you bin the size of the particle sizes, as shown on the left. If you use the mass of the particles, you still get different answers based on who you bin, but they're not spanning 15 orders of magnitude, they're now just a couple. But still, this is high variability that is very difficult to convert this into something that's usable for regulations. And the reason for this is that the vast majority of laboratories are using what's called monodisperse particles. They're using 5-micron polystyrene spheres. In the environment, for example, organisms are never exposed to monodisperse particle mixtures or particles. They're always exposed to an extremely complex, diverse spectrum of particles that we call polydisperse. So you can think of this like a fruit basket, and we have a lot of data for each individual fruit, but we don't have data for how all of those fruit are combined. One of the ways that we can solve this is by understanding how the particles cause harm, and then understand which dose metric is important. This is called an ecologically or toxicologically relevant metric. And for I mentioned before, the food dilution metric, this impact can be predicted by the volume of the particle. As long as the particle can be ingested by an organism, we care about the volume to predict that effect. We also have evidence for these tissue translocation-mediated toxicities, oxidative stress, inflammation, which go on to cause additional toxicities in virtually all organisms. And for this, we can predict the toxicity based on the surface area of the particle. It's really the surface of the particle interacting with different cells and tissues that can cause this oxidative stress. And for that, we have to exclude all the particles that don't accumulate in our tissues. So we're shifting from thinking about these binned particle sizes to a continuous spectrum of data. And we can do this using probability distributions with high granular data. This is a foundational part of this risk assessment framework. And let's say we just look at the global occurrence data of particles, microplastic particles, and compare that to what they're using in laboratory experiments, just by particle count. And this has been done for many years in the scientific literature for microplastics, and they always come to a graph that looks somewhat like this, where you see that there's very little overlap between where we see toxicity on the right and where we actually see microplastics in the environment. That's because they're comparing apples to oranges, or rather a fruit basket to individual fruit. If we align the data based on these ecologically relevant metrics, now we have a more significant overlap, and we find that these laboratory studies that we once considered to be completely unrealistic might actually be resembling environmental conditions. Note that there's still a lot of laboratory studies using much higher concentrations than what we are finding in the environment. That's still a good thing, because we need to understand the dose response curve for these first, before we can actually use that data to inform risk assessment. So now that we have a foundation understanding of what to do with this microplastics data and risk assessment, I'll show you how we actually applied it for ecosystem risk. First, we started by scraping the literature. We found 167 laboratory toxicity studies using microplastics in 117 species. Not all of these were considered reliable or useful for risk assessment. And we had a rigorous screening criteria for experimental design, particle characterization, and risk assessment applicability. And of those 167 studies, only 22 passed through these filters. And then we went on to an additional expert review for each individual study, aligned the data, the toxicity data for each individual study to the species that they were monitoring, and built a species sensitivity distribution off of those data points. So a species sensitivity distribution, commonly used for deriving regulatory thresholds for water quality objectives by the US EPA, and virtually all risk organizations globally. This is effectively, you line up the toxicity of the studies from the most to the least sensitive, and you can build a simple model that shows the distribution. With this model, you can now interpolate. And so you can say, well, let's protect 1% of the species, or 5% of the species, or sorry, 95% or 99% of the species, the opposite. So if you look at the bottom left corner here, you would just find the percentage of species affected, so say 5%, we call that the hazard concentration affecting 5%, or HC5. And you look down on the x-axis, there's your concentration for where you want to be health protected. So we applied this through a set of heuristics to account for different levels of confidence and uncertainty, and we derived 4 different thresholds. With the initial threshold, this is highly conservative. We're taking conservative assumptions wherever possible, and below this threshold, we don't anticipate ecological risks to be occurring. For the higher thresholds, here we're taking less conservative assumptions, and we are more confident that effects are truly occurring at these values. And so this confidence informs management. And if we're finding exceedances at the very lowest threshold, we would recommend additional monitoring. Whereas exceedances at these higher thresholds, we would require more costly remediation techniques or interventions. And we derived this for both the food dilution and the tissue translocation-based mechanisms. We also asked our experts, how confident are you in this process? The science is evolving really rapidly, and there's a lot of uncertainties. As far as the framework goes and the analytical process to reach these values, our experts had high to very high confidence. This is probably the approach that we're going to be using 10 years from now, something very similar to it. When it comes to the actual thresholds, we had low to medium low confidence. This is because the underlying studies that are populating these species sensitivity distributions are not perfect. Many of them are far from perfect. So we can improve the confidence by doing a couple better studies. And we made some discrete recommendations for researchers to do that. Additionally, this is really just looking at the particles without considering any of the other hazards that are associated with plastics. We are basically ignoring the additives, and we're ignoring something that is of increasing concern by scientists in this field, which is the antibiotic-resistant bacteria and pathogens that live on plastics. When plastics enter wastewater treatment plants, they absorb to bacteria, and it can prevent those bacteria from being taken out by the oxidative processes, chlorine, and other processes. And that means that we're getting higher antibiotic resistance genes and bacteria in the receiving waters as a result of microplastics. We know that this field is it's charging on rapidly, and we're seeing an exponential increase in the number of studies focused on the environment and human health for toxicity studies. And we realized that it's a monumental effort to do what we did. It would take many months to reproduce, and we want to lower the burden of that. We want to lower the barrier for researchers to do what we did. So first we made some recommendations about what researchers should do to increase the quality of these studies. And I did a little bit of modeling to see how we actually gotten better over time. And when it comes to the total overall score, the quality score of these studies, we have seen a significant increase in quality. When it comes, and almost all of this can be attributed to the technical quality. Researchers are just doing a better job of documenting and using these particles in labs, but the applicability for risk assessment is flatlined. There has been no increase in the applicability for risk assessment over time. And that's likely because a lot of these studies are not being designed for risk assessment. And that's where we're trying to change the narrative and get these laboratory studies to be as efficacious as they possibly can, hopefully informed by our research. And like I mentioned before, this was a big effort that would be very difficult to reproduce. Also, different regions have different priorities, they have different internal rules about how to derive a species sensitivity distribution, what types of statistics to use, even what type of organisms to use. You might not want to consider freshwater species, or maybe you do want to consider freshwater species, or maybe terrestrial species. All of that is modular and clickable in a R-Shiny application that we developed based on this toxicity database. And right now it's showing you just all of the myriad options that one could choose. This is a code-free application that is built on open source code. And within less than a minute, you can derive your own species sensitivity distribution. You don't have to learn any modeling along the way. One of the great things about this database and web tool is you can actually upload your toxicity data to it. So it is a living database and repository. It has a couple of other functions. It has also a machine learning algorithm that predicts the toxicity of microplastics using all the available data. So let's say you want to do an experiment in your laboratory with an organism that has never been exposed to plastics of a certain size. You're not sure where to look in the literature to choose your doses so that you find a good, nice dose response curve. You can just plug that into our machine learning model, and it'll give you a pretty good estimate of where to choose your doses. So now that we have a risk assessment framework, we've got those thresholds that we feel moderately confident about, we can actually apply these to monitoring data in the marine environment. We collected some microplastics data using manta trawl in San Francisco Bay through the San Francisco Estuary Institute, 5 jars, as well as the University of Toronto. And we had to, in order to relate the manta trawl collected microplastics to this laboratory toxicity data, we had to deal with some mismatches in the data. Again, this is this apples to oranges issue. The first issue is that manta trawl nets, just like a colander, allow fibers to go through the holes. And so we're undercounting fibers by a significant margin. The second challenge is that at the time, we were using manual methods to characterize the plastic particles. And so the University of Toronto team, Dr. Rockman's lab, needed to subset particles for characterization. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of how we actually identify these particles. This makes more sense. First, you collect plastic particles, you extract them in the laboratory, and get them on a plate. You put that plate under a microscope, you can take images, you can manually count them, and then you've got to confirm that they're actually plastic or not. And there's many different techniques to do this, but the most common is spectroscopic analysis. And at the time, Dr. Rockman's lab was using manual spectroscopy, which took about 25 hours per sample. So multiply this by like 100 samples, it's going to take a very, very long time to do. And so they had to take shortcuts. They had to choose which particles to spectroscopically analyze and which to not. They took a random approach. It was systematic, where they were looking at different particles and different parts of the plate that had been chosen by an algorithm. And so this was really good. We could use this data to extrapolate how many of those particles in the entire sample are actually plastic. The third and probably most significant challenge is that we're looking at particles of different sizes. Microplastics, just like any other particle in the environment, you're going to find higher abundances with smaller sizes. So that image that I showed at the very beginning with the toothpaste bead, where you can just see the particles just exponentially getting bigger, or more abundant the closer you look. The same holds true. So this is actually a distribution, size distribution, you can see. And so when you get below 10 microns or so, you really start to see that hockey stick distribution. For the manta trawl, you can only get down to about 333 microns, so you're really looking at the tip of the iceberg of the particle count. So the way that we corrected for this is using probability distributions based on high-resolution data that we have from global sources and from this particular study. And so what we end up with is combined correction factors. This is Monte Carlo modeling. And you get these combined correction factors of 2,819 with lower 95% confidence interval of 336 and higher upper 95% confidence interval of 18,000. So effectively, take your particle count, multiply it by 3,000, and you have the actual particle count. Now you can relate to a threshold with extremely high uncertainty. So once you apply these corrections, compare them to our risk thresholds, you can see that some portions of the San Francisco Bay, particularly the central portion, are exceeding these conservative thresholds, and some of them are even exceeding our least conservative thresholds. Luckily, we're not seeing a whole lot of toxicity out in the marine environment, out in the ocean, likely due to some mixing. And we already know how these particles move through the environment in San Francisco Bay based on some modeling studies populated with real data. We have tidal flushing that happens. This probably happens in Narragansett Bay as well. Every day, tide that comes in and out, and it brings these floating particles into the bay and out. The sinking particles, they tend to accumulate and fall into the central part. And so this model adds evidence to our understanding that there's likely some contamination happening, significant contamination in the central part of the bay. If we look at the uncertainty behind that map, you can see that the number of samples exceeding this conservative threshold ranges from about 25% to 100%. That's very, very high uncertainty bars for a regulatory decision, and our organization is considering what to do with this information. Likely we're going to be taking multiple lines of evidence to list a ruling under the 303D Act for this assessment. If we look at what's actually driving the uncertainty, we can do that because we controlled for all of it using Monte Carlo modeling. We can see that the spectroscopic subsampling accounts for the lowest amount of uncertainty. The size rescaling accounts for moderate amount of uncertainty, and the fact that we had to correct for all those missing fibers dominated the uncertainty. And so we can make some recommendations for how to reduce these uncertainties and prevent this sort of very complicated modeling, Monte Carlo modeling, to make these corrections going forward. So what we recommend anyone do for monitoring microplastics is use some type of inline filtration. This is a schematic of a device. You can see that it has a pump or a motor. The water goes in, it's got a filter stack, and then it's got a flow meter to tell you how much water went through. And a recent study compared that to a trawl sample, and you can see that the number of particles here versus the average pump simulation. You can also see the uncertainty is much higher with the manotrawl versus the pumps. There's a lot more to the story here. The trawl, you're getting a huge spatial area. You're characterizing plastics over a large area where your boat goes, whereas with this inline pump, you're just looking at the water at one very particular place. So you're getting different representativeness, but you're able to characterize those small particles. So we recommend doing a combination of both, and then using the high resolution particle data from the pump to correct for the trawls. So moving back to one of the original mandates I mentioned, drinking water, I'll walk you through what we did for the health effects determination for human health. So here we're working with far fewer studies. We only had 29 ingestion-based mammalian microplastics toxicity studies to work from. And of those 29, only 12 were deemed fit for purpose for risk assessment based on our quality screening. And then we went to additional expert review, not only with microplastics experts, but with physicians that were experts in the particular field of study for each study. So we consulted with about 9 independent experts on this. We rated the reliability of each endpoint, each study, to get a holistic understanding for what we know. And you can see here, I color-coded things based on the endpoints. Almost all of the information that we have that's reliable is for male reproduction. For one reason or another, about 6 studies came out in 2020 that were all focused on male reproduction, male reproductive impacts of microplastics, published in different parts of the world, using very similar techniques, but finding the same answer, which is we're finding impacts to sperm deformity and sperm count, as well as a myriad of other male reproductive related impacts. We also have a little bit of information for female reproduction, just one relevant biomarker that's been tested in urinary hormone concentration, a little bit of body weight, and then one study in the liver. So just to give you an example of one of these studies, looking at male reproduction, they exposed rodents to polystyrene of a very particular size, again monodisperse, and they not only looked at impacts to the apical endpoints, so looking at sperm count, testosterone, but they also looked at the mechanism, tried to determine the mechanism of toxicity. And they were, again, finding something that we found earlier, which is that oxidative stress or oxidative damage is likely involved in toxicity. We don't fully understand the effect mechanisms, but here's some that we have observed from these studies. Again, oxidative stress, which is closely related to reactive oxygen species formation, inflammation, cell death, lipid metabolism, and energy metabolism. Likely this is a particle, this is an effect that is applicable to virtually any type of particle. It doesn't necessarily need to be plastic. We went a step further, and of those reliable endpoints, we were able to extract dose response data And we did some benchmark dose modeling using the US EPA benchmark dose modeling software. And this gives us an idea for the range of toxicity for these different rodents. So you can see here with the uncertainty bars that we have a clustering of data right around this 1 milligram per kilogram a day. This seems to be, it could potentially be an artifact of these particular studies, but it could also indicate that there's actually a threshold happening at that dose. The most sensitive endpoint was for female reproductive impacts, as predicted by the anti-mullerian hormone concentration. And we used this as a conservative starting point to derive a screening level. Where would we find, if we used all this uncertainty and all this data, where would we find a potential health effect? And in order to make that relevant, compare it to what we're exposed to, we need to understand how much we're actually exposed to. We know that we accumulate microplastics and transfer them to our young. A number of recent studies have found microplastics in the majority of people tested in their lungs, blood, placenta, as well as in their breast milk. And if you look on social media, you'll probably think that microplastics is like the most common thing in diet. It is actually the base of the 2022 food pyramid. This is not from the FDA. And it's a common household spice. But getting more scientific about it, we know that microplastics exposure spans many orders of magnitude, depending on what you consume. And so here, looking at the total here on the right, this is from a probabilistic exposure assessment that was recently published. We can see that there's like 12 orders of magnitude of exposure variability. And part of this is reflected in the uncertainty of these studies. Part of this is just reflected in the variability of exposure. That statistic that you've probably heard, that we eat a credit card plastic per week, that is above the 99th percentile for this exposure assessment. Highly unlikely that we're eating that much per week based on the best available data. It's more like we're eating a grain of salt per week. But again, that doesn't really mean much unless you know what to compare it to. And so we took those benchmark doses and we overlaid that from the most conservative to the least conservative over this exposure assessment, and you can see that the interquartile range does overlap with our benchmark dose range, which for a risk assessment, or risk assessor, this is something that would warrant additional investigation and maybe make it a higher priority for looking into. So despite all of this effort that we did, we weren't actually able to derive regulatory thresholds for use in California. And this is based on 3 large bits of uncertainty. The effect database is largely inadequate. Most of these studies, they're not using realistic plastic particles as we knew, but they're also not doing a great job of characterizing what the particles actually are, what their sizes are. We need really high resolution information about the surface area, the charge, a lot more information than what these researchers are typically providing. We don't fully understand the effect mechanisms, which is not necessary for deriving regulations. But in this case, it might actually need to be fully resolved because we have to make some assumptions. We're going to have to extrapolate and use those toxicologically relevant metrics. And we don't have a complete exposure data set. That risk or the exposure assessment that I showed you earlier, it doesn't have really any food. It's got seafood, it's got salt, it's got beer, honey, but it doesn't have grains, meat, fruits, vegetables, which is like 80% of your diet. So it could be a dramatic underestimate. And we don't have any harmonized drinking water data. That's really a key thing in order to develop a drinking water concentration. So from all of this, we developed some research needs. Hopefully the research community is reading these publications and designing their experiments to inform risk assessment. And we are, we are communicating to consumers what we know, but we're not providing any numeric thresholds associated with those. We just feel certain. So moving on to some additional requirements from Senate Bill 1422, we're required to adopt a standardized method in accredited laboratories. Prior to the passing of this bill, there were not any standardized or even harmonized analytical methods for monitoring microplastics. So we had to develop our own. We conducted an inter-laboratory validation study based on a couple standard operating protocols that we developed. And we used 2 different types of spectroscopy. We had 26 laboratories from 7 different countries participate, including from academia, industry, municipal labs, as well as nonprofits. And we not only did this for drinking water, but we tackled ocean water, fish tissue, and sediment as well. So again, you take the particles, you extract them, look at them in a microscope, you do these chemical analyses. That's the main protocol. If you have these more complicated matrices, like fish tissue or something, there's a couple digestion steps that go in between here, but this is really the main flow through, main workflow. And to assess the reliability of these laboratories, we made some blind samples, and we put different polymers, 4 different polymers, and 4 different size fractions in there, as well as 4 different common shapes, and we even threw in some false positives to see if they're characterizing these particles as plastic or not. So we sent these samples to labs, asked them to run the standard operating protocol, and then we looked at the overall data in terms of recovery. So you can see here on the y-axis we have log recovery, and overall we had very poor recovery, averaging around 30%. And that's not the whole story, because again, we broke this up by all these different categories. If you look at the different sizes, we have very low recovery for the small sizes. This is expected. It's really difficult to see the small particles. But when you get above 20 microns, the reliability increases dramatically, and all of a sudden we're closer to that sweet spot range of 80 to 120% recovery. We also saw some self-contamination coming from gloves. That's why we have higher than expected blue particles and clear particles, and lower than expected for white. Maybe the laboratories were not looking closer at these white particles. Didn't think they were plastic. We also saw most of the contamination, or most of the over-reporting, was from fibers, likely due to clothing, shedding, and then for some reason we had lower than expected recovery for fragments, but almost perfect recovery for spheres. So we not only looked at the reliability of these assessments, we also looked at how much they cost and how long it takes to run them. Something key to doing a monitoring program is it has to be feasible and affordable. And so if you were to just use a microscope, not do any sort of chemical confirmation, you'd be about half right, or you'd be right half the time for whether or not it's plastic. So that's not good enough for regulations, especially when we use infrared and Raman and get closer to 90% or 95% accuracy. But it's going to take, it's going to be much more expensive. So here you can see Raman is more expensive than IR, both for the instrument and the consumables. And the main advantage of Raman is that you can get smaller particles. Largely, we see these methods as complementary, though. We like to see data from both. And this understanding that these methods that we have are expensive and time-consuming leads us to a tiered monitoring framework. This was really born out of this workshop that we did, where we ideally would have some kind of screening method, something that's quick and easy that tells you whether or not you have an issue with plastic or particles in general, and that would determine if you need to do additional monitoring, maybe using pyrolysis, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, something that tells you the mass of the particles, something that's quick and easy to run, but is more information and more costly than the screening method. And then we would reserve this detailed characterization for a select number of samples to get the data that we need without using all of our resources along the way. So we also provide laboratory accreditation through the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program. This is something that any laboratory in the world can apply for and become accredited for. We have 4 independent organizations, third-party laboratory assessors in the United States that are trained to accredit for this standard. They're spread out all over the United States. So if you know of a commercial laboratory that wants to get involved, there's likely a third-party assessor that can come and check them out, and then our agency will provide the accreditation. Included in this are inspections, documentation. We're working on developing performance evaluation samples with NIST, and then we also have quality criteria for labs. So now that we have a method and we can feel good about the results, now we can actually go out and acquire some monitoring in California. And it's first important to understand the limitations of what our methods can do, as well as how these particles move through treatment plants. Treatment processes, drinking water treatment processes, already remove a lot of microplastics. Most treatment plants that are using surface water as their source water, as opposed to groundwater, are removing microplastics with flocculation and sedimentation. This is an extremely common technique that's used, and it removes particles down to about 1 micron or so. And unfortunately for us, our method limitations are right around that range. So if we were to look for microplastics in treated drinking water using these methods, if they're using this technique, this treatment technique, we're probably not going to find the particles. But that's not to say that they're not removing particles. It's unlikely they're removing particles smaller than the size range, unless they're using these more advanced techniques, microfiltration, ultrafiltration, RF, nanofiltration. So this is a bit of a conundrum, because we've been tasked with the legislature to look for microplastics in drinking water, and we developed a method that can't find microplastics in drinking water. So what do we do? Back to these probability distributions. We know that with higher resolution instruments, this size distribution is fairly consistent. And if you know the shape of the iceberg, and you measure what's visible, you can now interpolate what's not visible, what's below the surface, with some uncertainty, right? And so we're leveraging that information to develop a three-tiered or three-phased approach for monitoring. This was just adopted on September 7th of this year, and it includes a 1-year pilot phase where we're just trying these methods out. We're getting the laboratories that want to be accredited on board and testing their capabilities with real-world samples. We're getting our sampling protocol finalized and basically just building infrastructure. And then in 2023, the end of 2023, we're going to be sending monitoring orders to about 30 water systems in California that serve water to over 50% of the population. And we're going to ask them to monitor quarterly for microplastics in their source waters. So not what's in the treated drinking water, but what goes into the plant. Ideally, we'd be developing a tier 1 surrogate fast screening method along the way, so that when we come back for the second, or the final phase, we'll be able to use the tiered monitoring approach first, and then look into treated waters and additional systems. Hopefully by then, I feel pretty confident that by 2025 or so, we will have an analytical method that can see the particles in treated drinking water. We're already working on quite a few that seem quite promising. So here's a map of where the locations are in the state. You can see that we have fairly good geospatial coverage. The vast majority of the population in California is in Los Angeles or San Francisco area, and so that's where most of our monitoring orders are going to be sent to. So what to tell people when they have microplastics in their tap water? Literally any amount is probably going to frighten people. Even if you say it's 1 particle per liter or 1,000, none of it sounds good, right? As we know from the media. So one thing that we're going to tell people is, well, don't reach for the plastic water bottle, because that is usually the default thing that people do when they find out they have anything in their drinking water that's really harmful. And the reason that we feel confident about saying that is that based on the best available data, bottled water has approximately 3 times higher concentrations of microplastics than tap water on average. And this is not surprising because most of these particles come from the bottle themselves. Just unscrewing the lid sheds particles, which you can, again, visualize with scanning electron microscopy. But these particles are the water is bottled in a plastic plant. With people wearing clothing made of plastic, you're going to find plastic in bottled water. So another critical part of this pilot phase and for getting the infrastructure up for regulations is managing the data. And this is what a typical data set looks like from a microplastic study for one sample. Each one of these colored points is a different polymer. And you can bin that, you can visualize it in many different ways, but basically what you have is a massive spreadsheet. Sometimes it's gigabytes for a single sample. And that doesn't really fit well in a regulatory database that allows you to say one thing, what's the concentration. And so we're building our own database. And not only will it be able to capture the full granularity of these particles, but we're also going to include a lot more parameters. We recommend that there's over 100 parameters that should be collected and recorded in any microplastics monitoring study. This database is going to be open source, which will allow it to evolve rapidly, be transparent, and be picked up by anyone else in the world that wants to use it. So hopefully this becomes some sort of global standard at some point, and it's largely going to be built on a CCAN repository as well as integrate with existing databases that people already use, like OpenSpec. And that'll basically, it will connect to CIDWIS, which is the EPA Safe Drinking Water Information System. So anyone looking for microplastics online, they'll find it in CIDWIS, and then it'll direct it back to this microplastics portal. So taking a step back, thinking about microplastics management as a whole, the Senate Bill 1263 required that we have a strategy to dealing with microplastics in the long term. We adopted this earlier this year, and it's a two-track strategy. The first track is taking no regrets solutions that can be implemented now. This includes pollution prevention, pathway interventions, as well as outreach and education. The second track requires a little bit more science and is more iterative. Here we're doing some monitoring, assessing risks, figuring out the sources and pathways, and then implementing new solutions. I'll give you a couple examples. So in 2015, maybe it was 16, California banned plastic bags statewide. But before that, we had local bag bans in Los Angeles and other areas. And the monitoring data from the 2013 survey from the Southern California bite shows, relative to 2018 bite, we see significant reduction in the number of plastic bags. So here we're using this monitoring data, and we're showing that the policy is actually having an impact. And so you can see this is sort of like the iterative monitoring, or the iterative approach to evaluating these new solutions. Mentioned earlier. So I'll give you another example that's a bit more modern, which is really thinking about these rubber fragments. These are mostly derived from tires. They can aggregate with the road and make more complicated particles. And in that survey that we did of microplastics in the San Francisco Bay, we saw that the vast majority of particles were either fibers, probably from clothes, or rubbery fragments or firm fragments. And these rubbery fragments, again, these are shed from tires. And if you look at your tire and you look at the tread, see the tread indicator that tells you how bald it is, those particles, they don't just like magically disappear, they basically just all go into the watershed. And so multiply that by how many cars are driving on the road every single day, now you have what turns out to be quite a big problem. This is what these particles actually look like on their microscope. Not only do we have these particles, but they are contaminated with some very harmful compounds. We know that zinc and 6-ppd-quinone cause lethal impacts to a number of aquatic organisms. And a study published in 2020 found that 6-ppd-quinone is a ubiquitous tire additive that causes acute mortality in coho salmon and is likely responsible for the decline in populations in the Pacific Northwest. If you look at the LC50 of 6-ppd-quinone and compare it to the receiving waters in Seattle and San Francisco, you see a little bit of overlap, and with San Francisco, actually, there's quite a bit of overlap above the LC50. That's something, as a risk assessor, is like your head's on fire when you see that. Luckily, we already have some solutions. San Francisco Estuary Institute, alongside this monitoring study for tire wear particles, they looked for microplastics, for specifically tire wear particles, going in and out of green stormwater infrastructure. It looks like this. Doesn't really look like much other than a field, but it's actually doing a really big job. These are highly engineered landscapes that capture pollutants and incidentally do a really good job of capturing microplastics. They had an 84% capture rate in this one study, and this can be implemented in many different regions that have different stormwater issues with receiving waters. This is moving on to a little bit of a segue and thinking more about the bigger plastics and what to do with them. These are two rivers in Southern California. This was in San Jose, so this is in Northern California, and this was in the Los Angeles River. We passed in 2015, it's called the Trash Total Maximum Daily Load, statewide trash policy, and this sets a water quality objective of 0 for trash in any water in California. So if there is a single piece of trash, it violates the law, and this sets provides a regulatory pathway for mitigating this through a prohibition on all trash discharges, and then expectations for stormwater infrastructure. So we have 2 different compliance pathways that municipalities can meet. One is what's called a trash full capture system, and this is, I'll read it because it is quite important, a stormwater treatment control or series of treatment controls that trap all particles that are 5 millimeters or greater, and has a design treatment capacity that is not less than the peak flow rate resulting from a 1-year, 1-hour storm in the sub-drainage area. So you can see here the things that are highlighted are worth paying attention to. Trap all particles and that are 5 millimeters or greater. So that sets basically a de facto upper limit for what we consider microplastics, because those are the particles that are making it through all this infrastructure. And then also we have a 1-year, 1-hour storm. In California, we have, if we're lucky, we will get a 1-week storm that obliterates everything. And so we have a lot of issues with this. This might be a little bit easier to do on the East Coast where you have more consistent rain. But we also have Track 2, which is a trash full capture system equivalent. And that's basically just doing monitoring and saying, yeah, we're already removing trash by different ways. We don't have to capture it fully. Here's what these trash capture devices actually look like. This is a very simple one for a small area. This can go in a gutter or below a manhole cover. So basically just a little net mesh. If you have a very large stormwater drainage, this is like in Livermore, California, you can put these giant nets that just you got to make sure you unload them at some point, but they will fill up with trash and capture all sorts of other things as well. And then for the Track 2, you can actually do what's called true source control, or institutional source control. Here you can do things like actually banning different types of single-use plastics, doing cleanups, street sweeping, improving container management, so really thinking more upstream. So this is an option for municipalities. And I want to transition a bit. We're thinking a lot of, I know this is about the estuary program, this is about the estuary, but plastic has always really been thought of as an ocean issue, and it's only until recently been considered more of a backyard issue. And we're finding it more and more relevant for terrestrial contamination and human contamination. So this is a plot of the increase of microfibers over time and which compartments they're going into. Obviously the majority is water bodies, but the amount going to terrestrial environments is increasing. The vast majority of this is coming from polyester from our clothing. And the way that it gets there is through the wastewater treatment plant, through a washing machine. So you put your clothes into a washing machine, it sheds, and those particles, they go to a wastewater treatment plant. The vast majority goes to biosolids, 95%, and a lot of, overall in the United States, 74% of that goes to land. So, let's see, I already gave you the answer. So this is for the United States. This is where the biosolids go in the United States overall. 40% goes to agriculture to grow our food, 26% to landfill burial, 15% is just burnt, and then 11% is Class A distribution, and there's some smaller categories there. And this is really heterogeneous. So in Rhode Island, in green here, there's less than 10% of biosolids actually go to agriculture. And really most of the East Coast is not doing a whole lot with their biosolids in terms of ag. Whereas California and Midwestern states are using a really high amount of biosolids for growing food and different crops. And why do we care? We know that plants can uptake and accumulate microplastics through their roots and be distributed out through the shoots and sometimes into the edible portions of the plant. And unfortunately, with high enough concentration, this will reduce the plant growth and it will reduce the plant productivity, producing less fruits and vegetables. So it's only a matter of time before the agricultural lands that are spread with biosolids will be so contaminated that they are no longer able to support the crops that grow, at least not to the amount that they want to. Also, this is an environmental justice issue. These biosolids are typically produced in high-income urban populations, Los Angeles, San Diego, as well as San Francisco area in California, and they are transported inland to predominantly migrant worker populations, disadvantaged communities where they do the farming. And so we're basically just transporting the pollution, we're not actually treating it. And if you start talking about this issue, everybody starts pointing fingers at each other. You got the washing machine industry saying, hey, it's the wastewater treatment plant's fault. And they're pointing to the textile producers, pointing to the washing machine industry. And really, this is something that we can engage all of these stakeholders on and try and address this through all possible solutions. One of the easiest and most effective ways is actually at the washing machine. There are a number of filters that you can install in your washing machine. This small pilot study up in the University of Toronto, they installed these in about 10% of homes, and they found a significant reduction in the number of microfibers coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. California tried to make a number of laws in the past few years. One just as recently as a few months ago just died that would have required all new washing machines to have these filters. France was successful in doing that. All new washing machines in France have to have a microfiber filter. And so we're hopeful that we'll get there eventually, but there's a lot of technical challenges with doing that. And then for the textiles themselves, we can design this better. We had a microfiber innovation challenge earlier this year that provided $650,000 to anyone that can innovate in this space and replace textiles that are sources of plastic microfibers with better natural alternatives, and then prevent the shedding of particles, these fibers from plastic clothing. We're also tracking some legislation that's going on nationally. The Safer Seas Act of 2.0 has a draft report on microfiber pollution that is open for public comment until October 17th. So if you focus closely on microfibers and you haven't had a chance to read this and provide a public comment, we have a little bit more than a week to do so. And I'll give you an idea of some other large-scale policy that's happening in California. Could be a model elsewhere. SB 1335 requires that food service packaging in state-owned facilities have to be reusable, compostable, or recyclable by 2026. So that's 100% of all packaging in these facilities. And our Cal Recycle agency has a list of all of the packaging materials that meet this standard. So if you want to be on that list, you have to meet some very specific criteria. If you want to be a biodegradable plastic for this list, you cannot contain PFAS or any other chemicals on our Proposition 65 list. The Proposition 65 list is, if you've ever been to California, it says, this facility contains chemicals known in the state of California to cause reproductive harm or cancer. So that's a really massive list, and so that's where we're setting our baseline for that. We also just passed the Comprehensive Packaging Extended Producer Responsibility Act, Senate Bill 54. This requires that all packaging materials are recycled, not just recyclable, but recycled, and composted 30% by 2028 and 65% by 2032. And it creates an independent producer responsibility organization to hold the manufacturers accountable. And we get $5 billion over 10 years from industry to mitigate existing impacts. So this is a monumental bill, but it really begs the question of, are bioplastics actually a solution to plastic pollution? And first, it's really important to understand that not all bioplastics are created equally. Some of these are actually biodegradable, and many of them are not. It can be bio-based, and it can be not biodegradable, and it can be petroleum-based, and it can be biodegradable. So we like to focus on the bio-based, biodegradable plastics when we're thinking about bioplastics as a solution. This includes things like polylactic acid, like hydroxyalkanoate, starch blends, and some others. But when we're thinking about materials at a global scale, and really this is a global issue that requires global policy to address, we have to understand that our planet has finite boundaries. And there's a group that calls this the planetary boundaries. And we are already outside the safe operating space of the planetary boundaries for biogeochemical flows, phosphorus and nitrogen. We have limited phosphorus and nitrogen reserves, which are required to grow food, and now plastic. We've recently characterized novel entities here as being exceeded as well. Novel entities is defined as chemicals that we don't know what they do, that are globally contaminated, that have already globally contaminated our environment. And microplastics is one of those novel entities. Luckily for us, we've solved some other things like the stratospheric ozone depletion. That's not something that is an imminent threat, but we have a lot more imminent threats that we have already exceeded the planetary boundaries on. So we envision a greener future where we're not just producing and disposing or just extracting. And this is currently what's business as usual. It's a one-way street, taking fossil fuels and putting them into greenhouse gas emissions, plastics, toxic chemicals, biodiversity loss, soil depletion. What we potentially could do is just replace fossil fuels with bio-based feedstock to do the exact same thing. We could make this circular though, and use renewable agriculture with bio-based feedstock to reduce the amount of plastic pollution overall going to the environment, and only use these fossil fuels to make durable plastics that are meant to last a very long time and be recycled. We can also innovate and make safer by design products that don't release toxic chemicals. Bio-based plastics, they contain just the same number of toxic chemicals as non-bio-based plastics. Recent study using bioassays found that, on average, bioplastics contain higher abundance of these contain anti-androgenic activity than conventional-based plastics. And that's why we have to be thinking about green chemistry. We have to set these regulations up before the plastics are made, which is why we have a green chemistry program in California. I mentioned before, this is a global issue, requires global change, and right now we have a patchwork of policies worldwide. The last time that we had an international binding treaty on plastics was in 1991. This was the Operation Clean Sweep. We had a number of binding treaties before then. The London Convention, Marpol Annex 5, UNCLOS, all of these had varying success, but they were binding. It actually meant something. Since then, we've had a lot of voluntary agreements, which don't add up to much at the end of the day, which is why the United Nations Environmental Program earlier this year agreed to negotiate a global treaty on plastics. This is a really huge news. And currently there are many conversations going on in the scientific community about how to do this right and combat a lot of the misinformation out there by the industry. And one thing that we know absolutely has to be included in this global policy is a reduction target. Multiple high-profile studies have found recently that if you just focus on recycling, you are effectively going to flatline the amount of plastic that you make, but this is a really high amount of plastic you're making every year. We have to knock off the reduction part. We have to reduce, and that's going to get us down 30% of the plastic that we're making, and hopefully get us to actually decrease the amount of plastic we're making every year, and not just continue to make the amount that we're making now. We hope that California can be a model for Rhode Island and other states for the intervention that we're doing, and we're actually called out by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine earlier about how we can inform these policies. And if anyone wants to be involved, we have a work group to discuss the nitty-gritty details of microplastics and how to monitor them. We're developing a sampling and analysis playbook, something that's an open document that can be contributed by anyone. We have a communication toolbox for how to talk about the risks, and then how to get accredited, what to do with data. We meet quarterly, and if anyone wants to subscribe, take a picture of this and subscribe, or just ask me later. And then we also invite you to join our data dives. We've been doing trash data dives since 2018. This is an annual event that brings together water, trash, and data enthusiasts that consider ways to inform management. So we talk about a lot of issues, but marine debris, tobacco, public outreach, machine learning, plastics and big data, public issues and outreach, homelessness. All of these issues are related to this trash issue. And some of the things that we've done recently, some really cool things, is taking drones and combining that with a deep learning algorithm to characterize trash from air, as well as from cars. This allows us to do large surveys at very limited time, very low time. And we have installed cameras on the sides of street sweepers in Los Angeles. And we have this machine learning algorithm that identifies cigarette butts along the street, as well as other trash. And so we build a map where all the cigarette butts are in LA's freeways. And that's really useful for informing management. We also built a trash taxonomy tree. This is a way to harmonize data from lots of different sources. Everybody calls different things, and we want them to all be called the same thing so that data scientists can play with the data. Lastly, I'll leave you with something that is not related to the state of California, but is really just a side project thing that I've been doing, which is called the Plastiverse. And basically, the idea is that all of these different researchers, groups, organizations are making their own cool data portals and toolkits, and it's a dizzying amount of websites and information to keep track of, and there's not a single place to hold them. And so we created a very simple website that all it is a living database that allows people to look at the tools that have already been developed. There's some different filters on here so you can find what you're looking for. Eventually we're going to have a lot more, calendar, blog, events, a way for the community to come to one place and share information. And thank you all so much for your attention. I'm really excited to be here and happy to talk to you during the break.
All right, folks, so we're gonna kind of do something cool here. I'm gonna ask Scott, Rebecca, and Jed to come up to the center, and we're just gonna ask them a few questions. If you do need to get up, stretch your legs, let your brain cool down for a bit, go right ahead. Again, we still have snacks outside, but they're gonna be here, and hopefully they'll be hanging out with us for the rest of the day. Once the break is over, don't go too far, because we're actually gonna now take a very local dive and hear where we're finding plastic here in the watershed. So come on back. So we'll do this for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for the next panel.